it's about time that we have this type of document that really levels the playing field and sets the standard. But then yet, when you're trying to apply this type of standard to different healthcare settings that were never used to being held to this level of care, I think the requirements held within that were concerning about how to implement them, because not only do we talk about the steps of scope reprocessing, but we talk about personnel considerations and education, training, competencies, certification requirements, workflow within a reprocessing area, design of the department, facilities, everything combined into one document. So I think for some facilities, it might have been overwhelming to digest that information, because this is a big document and so much information to be contained in it.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of the healthcare industry committed to getting it right. Every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Hank Balch and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Ann Drosnock, Manager of Clinical Education for Endoscopy with Healthmark Industries. Previously, Ann managed the infection control program and device reprocessing functions for Olympus America, which included the development of position statements and policies regarding device compatibility, along with health and safety information related to device utilization and reprocessing. Hank, flexible scopes, it's a hot topic right now.
That's right, Justin, and you cannot have a sterile processing podcast without talking about the big scope question, and in particular, how to do it right. I'm excited to talk to Ann today, not only about her experience and expertise on the scope issue, but also her involvement with the working group that created the ST91 document.
Yeah, and they just had a meeting a couple of weeks back, so I know there'll be some new information that hopefully she'll be able to share with us, as well as I'm just curious always. We are working in a process-oriented world. I'm interested in hearing what those work group processes are like and what goes into all of that.
And as always, we're going to be focusing and hopefully getting some ideas from her on how teams inside facilities can be pushing education, continuing opportunities to grow in knowledge. Even if you're not the folks today who are responsible for scopes, you may be the folks tomorrow who are. So I want to ask those questions in particular and get that information out to our listeners.
All right. Well, I'm excited to get into it with Ann. As a reminder, you can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info, the Facebook page, facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast, and LinkedIn, linkedin.com/company/Beyond Clean. And finally, if you have questions for the show, maybe there's a guest that you'd like to recommend that we reach out to and have on a future episode, or just general commentary for Hank or myself, you can send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with Ann Drosnock. Joining us now is Ann Drosnock, Manager of Clinical Education for Endoscopy with Healthmark Industries. Ann, I want to welcome you to the show. Hank and I are excited to learn a little bit about ST91 and the process at AAMI in our interview today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me tonight.
Why don't we just start with a little bit of your background, maybe introduce yourself to our listeners. We have had a lot of interviews that way lately, but would be nice to have you back on in the future, and maybe we won't have to dive in and introduce you to our listeners. But for those that aren't familiar with your work, give them a little bit of a background.
As Justin said, this is Ann Drosnock, and I'm Manager of Clinical Education at Healthmark Industries. In addition to that, I'm also co-chair of the Working Group 84, which is responsible for writing the AAMI document ST91, which is the national standard for flexible and semi-rigid endoscope reprocessing in healthcare facilities. So I've been with Healthmark for a little over 2 years now in this role for education. Previous to that, I worked for Olympus as the manager of infection control for reprocessing. of the flexible scopes and also surgical products for the U.S. and Canada. I was there for about 5 years, and before that I was more into the microbiology side. I taught microbiology at a local college, and previous to that then worked in pharmaceutical microbiology, where I managed the R&D and quality control labs for micro, but that was on the pharmaceutical side. So that's a little bit about my background.
Well, that's excellent. You definitely have a lot of experience. I can see why you're in that work group. How did you sort of find your current role? What interested you about the field in general? I know you've had a diverse background, but how did you wind up where you are today?
It's a funny story, actually. As I said, I had started out in pharmaceutical microbiology and then teaching that to nurses and to technicians that were coming into the field of pharmaceutical and medical device, but I really wasn't familiar with the device side of things or even how hospitals operated. And several years ago, I had found out that I was pregnant with my third child, and my husband's company closed unexpectedly, so I was still home taking some time off with that pregnancy, and I was looking to get back into the field. So a friend of mine worked in the medical device arena, and then so locally here, where I am in Pennsylvania, there was an opening for a position that I ended up finding interesting and had interviewed for the position and got that position. So coming into the Olympus side of things with the endoscopes, I really at the beginning didn't have any background into that, so was provided a lot of educational presentations and training regards to how devices are reprocessed. Saw a lot of cases, was in facilities, really getting hands-on reprocessing scopes, and had my own lab there where I learned from the ground up how to reprocess these endoscopes and just how challenging it can be. So from there, I learned to love the hospital side of things and really feeling like I had that effect on patient care and outcomes that I didn't necessarily feel in the pharmaceutical industry, because you're so far removed from seeing the effects of what your daily work is when you're in the quality control side of it. But being in the infection control and device reprocessing side, I felt like I had that direct connection, and that by educating people, which is what I'm very passionate about doing, I could have that direct impact then to make sure that these devices are properly reprocessed each and every time.
Yeah, it's such an important aspect. I think with the changes just in healthcare reform, I'm not going to say that there wasn't an emphasis on infection control in healthcare. Of course there was, but obviously the game has changed somewhat.
Yeah, for sure. There is such an emphasis on infection prevention in the healthcare setting and preventing those readmissions due to healthcare-acquired infections and being tied to reimbursements. All of that is so critical at this point. And because of that, there's been such an emphasis placed on reprocessing, especially tied to the endoscopes, but really any sort of reprocessing in healthcare that has brought all of this to light. So because of those reforms, I feel like these devices are getting the attention that they didn't necessarily get before, and that is so important now for it to be in the forefront of everyone's minds.
So, Mary Ann, you mentioned your background with the co-chair of Workgroup 84 with AAMI. Can you give us a baseline introduction to what AAMI is, how it works, who's involved, and in particular, what is a work group?
Sure, Hank. So AAMI stands for the Association for the Advancement in Medical Instrumentation, and they are an organization that's dedicated to advancing the science, the development, safe and effective use of any medical technology. So AAMI, AAMI, that we're familiar with mostly is the ST91 standard, which is the steam sterilization standard for the U.S. in how to operate that in healthcare facilities. So that's what we're most familiar with. But what a lot of people don't know is there's many other standards that are out there. And right now, Working Group 84, which is responsible for writing the ST91 document, is, when we meet, it's the second largest group right now, and that's dedicated solely to endoscope reprocessing. So you see why I get so excited about this. there's so much emphasis now placed on it. We're rivaling sterilization as far as size of the group. But what is the working group? So that is the group that you join at AAMI that's dedicated to a topic. Like I said, ST79, they write the steam sterilization document. In ST91, we write the flexible and semi-rigid endoscope document. So you have to apply to join that group if you want voting rights for it. So it's open to the public as far as the meetings go. But if you really truly want to be a part of the creation of these documents or the updating of them, then you have to apply through AAMI to be a member of that group. And that gives you then the rights to vote on documents or issues that have come up for revision, things like that. So that's what it means to be part of that working group and part of AAMI itself.
And as just a point of information, the folks and the members on those groups, they are both vendors and users, meaning folks who are currently working in the field at the point of care. Is that correct?
Yeah, Hank, that's a great question and something worth spending some time on. So I don't think people really understand what the makeup of AAMI is. And the group itself consists of 2 co-chairs. Usually you have one representative who's from industry, and then you have one representative who's from a user facility. And then one of those co-chairs may also be from a regulatory function, like a worker from FDA might be one of the co-chairs. So even co-chairs were made up of different roles within the healthcare setting, whether it be user or a vendor, what we call industry, or even regulator. But within the group itself, as far as membership goes, the same thing applies. You have people coming from all different realms within the healthcare environment. So as we said, we have part of that segment then made up with industry, so vendor representatives. Then you also have a good portion of that's made up of representatives from user facilities. So whoever that hospital or other healthcare facility might designate as their representative to go to these AAMI meetings. Then you also have some independent people there who might be, former hospital employees or consultants, things like that. Then we have another large segment which is made up of representatives from other professional societies. So we talk about gaining consensus from different organizations that are out there. Well, within AAMI, we solicit the membership then from these other professional societies. So, for example, on ST91, we have attendees from SGNA, from ISHM, from ASGE, from APIC. So all of these different societies that come and sit around this table with us and help in writing the document and make those decisions. So the final group then that we have is the regulatory aspect. So we do have representatives from FDA. Actually, we have several that will attend our ST91 meetings. And the same thing applies then to the other groups. So you get this fair balance between the different aspects and the different segments of who would be involved in the healthcare setting.
I love that setup in particular because it gives equal voice regardless of where you're coming from. As you say, you can be from the FDA or you can be a sterile processing or endo leader in a hospital, and you still get the opportunity to stand up and say yay or nay, or, maybe can we change this? And he said try to move toward a consensus that is agreeable, not just is this the best practice and the best recommendation that we can give, but what is it going to impact across that spectrum of industry and user side of things?
Exactly.
So here recently, I know AAMI had a few meetings. Was the work group that you're involved with a part of those meetings?
Yeah, we actually met last week, so that was mid-October, and we devoted a full day and a half to the discussion of ST91, and we're actually in the process of updating this document as we speak. The original version came out in 2015. That was the first issue of ST91. And we decided then once that was issued that things are changing at such a fast pace right now with what we know about endoscopy and reprocessing of those scopes that it warranted starting the update right away. So we're in the midst of that now, and we had solicited comments on the ST91 document. Originally, we received over 460 comments on the current version of ST91. And over the last, I would say it's been at least a year now, maybe a little bit longer, we worked our way through those original 460 comments that were received on ST91 through these meetings where we, such as last week when we get together in person, but also having teleconferences, again, where everybody's invited, and we go through each and every one of those comments. So everybody's voice is heard, and every challenge or every comment that we get then has to be resolved. So we went through those, and then we came out with another working document, a working draft. And that's what was out for comment then that we discussed at the meeting last week of the AAMI group, which happened in Baltimore. And so we did meet for that day and a half, and we went through those second round of comments. To that end, then we went from 460 comments the first time down to, I think it was around 320 comments that we received the second time around. So, yeah, so still a lot of information and comments out there. We made it through a little over half of them in a full day and a half meeting in person. So it is very time-consuming and a lengthy process to make sure that everybody's voice is heard and really working through where we are today and where we need to be in the future. So it's quite a long and involved process to get these documents updated.
Are those comments, and don't mind me for not knowing, but are those comments published publicly, and then your responses, do they have to be addressed publicly, or is that something that is worked through, but it's more worked through in private in the meetings?
It's my understanding that they're worked through in the meetings, and it's those that are considered that have applied for membership in the group that have access to those. I don't believe that the comments and resolutions are made public to everyone, but what will come out of that once we resolve all those comments is a new working draft that then will again go out for comment. You get to a point, though, when we have a working draft in a good enough position that we feel it's ready to go out for public comment, then at that point we'll do it. So we're not quite there in the process yet.
It certainly sounds like something that you have to have a passion for. Obviously 460 comments and working through that in a group. I hesitate to use the word tedious, but it does sound like a pretty, involved process, and you must have a lot of passion for this industry to be involved in that practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I do. I definitely am passionate about this document, but in general, the whole endoscope reprocessing arena, and making sure that we're doing everything we can based on what we're learning every day with current research and everything else that's going on to make sure that these scopes are being properly reprocessed each and every time. And having this ST91 document, this national standard, holds everyone accountable to the same standard of care, because this document is applicable to all flexible and semi-rigid scopes. So we're not saying something different for GI scopes versus bronchoscopes or cystoscopes. It really levels the playing field as far as what's expected for quality, what's expected for best practices. And the other great thing about ST91 is it's applicable to all healthcare settings. So we're not expecting a higher standard of care in a hospital setting versus what's done in a standalone ASC or even in a physician's office. So this document really levels the playing field as far as expectation goes. So yes, to get back to what you originally said, it is something I'm very passionate about. And then, taking that one step further, the education about this document and scope reprocessing in general.
Well, that's excellent information. I'm all for standardization as much as possible across all spectrums. So that's really good to hear. And when we come back after a short break, we'll be talking a little bit more in detail and getting an overview of ST91. We are back with Ann Drosnock, Manager of Clinical Education for Endoscopy with Healthmark Industries. And now we're going to get a little bit more in-depth overview of ST91. Let's go right to the beginning, Ann. Let's talk about the background to ST91. Why did it come about? How was it formed? And I think, as you said early on, everybody's very familiar with ST79, but now let's talk about 91 and what this one is all about.
Okay, so ST originated several years ago. I mean, we're talking back to, it must have been 2011 or 2012 when the idea first was brought to AAMI, and I actually don't remember who raised the issue, but to create a document related to best practices for endoscope reprocessing for healthcare facilities. And the original intent of this was to make it a TIR, which is a technical information report, which is from AAMI, but those are very much informational topics, not necessarily held to the same level as a standard. So that's what the ST is. ST91 means then it's a full national standard, whereas underneath that then you have the TIRs, the technical information report. So originally the idea was brought forth to make it a technical information report. And when the group first got together then, again, I think that was 2012, early in the year we started and we were talking about this and the importance of it and how there were different recommendations out there based on the type of scope that you're reprocessing or the professional society that you follow. And those guidelines then can differ a lot depending on which of those guidelines you were following. But really, as I said earlier, the same standard of care should apply, and the scopes are generally reprocessed in the same way. You just have different types of scopes or configurations of channels. They may be more or less complex, but the general process is the same on how to make sure that they're processed correctly. So as we were going through this as a group, we thought, why are we making this informational? This is really content that should be a national standard. So very quickly then, the thought of this document was moved from a TIR to ST91, and we had the backing of AAMI and the full working group to make sure that this originally came to light as a standard, not the technical information report. And as I said, we worked then through those first couple years and issued the first version, which is still the current version of ST91, which was released in 2015.
So, Ann, I remember, I believe I was a sterile processing manager at the time that ST91 came out, and when I first heard of it, it was music to my ears. I said, oh, great, we have got an entire standard now that's going to pinpoint laser focus on these scope questions and issues. That was my perception, but overall throughout the industry, how do you think that initial 2015 release of ST91 was received by the masses?
Well, I think there was a variety of reactions. As you said, it's about time that we have this type of document that really levels the playing field and sets the standard. But then yet, when you're trying to apply this type of standard to different healthcare settings that were never used to being held to this level of care, I think the requirements held within that were concerning about how to implement them because, not only do we talk about the steps of scope reprocessing, but we talk about, personnel considerations and education, training, competencies, certification requirements, workflow within a reprocessing area, design of the department, facilities, everything combined into one document. So I think for some facilities, it might have been overwhelming to digest that information because this is a big document, and so much information to be contained in it. I think it was a little easier on the hospital side of things to digest and implement, but in those other areas that they want to comply with the AAMI standards, it's taken a little more work on their end.
I would imagine all of that information can lead to, some misunderstandings, or again, just to dive into all of it and know it like the Bible on the back of your hand, it can be difficult. What are some of the misunderstood sections? I know there's a big push right now in terms of sterilization. We see a lot of information out there about let's have all of the flexible scopes sterilized, and as we know, especially in the GI world, that it's high-level disinfected. So, maybe talk about some of the areas of the documents that are misunderstood and clarify that for some of our listeners as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can do that. So the first thing that I would talk about is that within ST91, there is a lot of information, a huge section on quality control and how to engineer steps in to make sure that your process is of the highest quality. So things like doing cleaning, verification, testing, and monitoring your processes and getting those feedback mechanisms that we're so used to in the sterilization realm. So I think that that's an area that people really need to focus on in this document, absorb those quality control parameters so that facilities can do the very best job that they can by engineering in these different quality control parameters. The other thing that you alluded to is sterilization. And within ST91, we have a huge section on sterilization of flexible and semi-rigid endoscopes because there are many of them, many different types of endoscopes that can easily be sterilized. So yes, we're used to thinking about GI scopes alone, but there are many other types of scopes, bronchoscopes, your cysto, your ureteroscopes, your ENT scopes that we classify as surgical flexible scopes. They're smaller bodies, small diameter, and many of those, not all, but many of those can be sterilized by different methods, such as vaporized hydrogen peroxide systems, ethylene oxide, things like that. So that's why there's a large section in ST91 devoted to sterilization. Now you talk about moving scope to sterilization. Well, I'll make the caveat that many of these scopes can already be sterilized. And if you look at the original classification system that we follow today, which was called the Spalding classification system, it originated in the 1960s, that says that critical devices, so those used in sterile areas, have to be sterile. And then below that, then you have semi-critical devices that will contact intact skin and things like the mucosa. This is where your flexible endoscopes fall in that semi-critical category. Now, what many people don't understand is this classification system has always said that semi-critical devices should be sterilized. And if that's not technically feasible, then we would fall to high-level disinfection as the standard of care. But over the years, I think that industry and healthcare facilities have just resorted to high-level disinfection of these scopes without really knowing that the original intent of the Spalding classification system was that semi-critical devices would be sterilized. So that's why we've included this large section on sterilization, because if you do have a type of scope like ureteroscopes, bronchoscopes, cystoscopes that can be sterilized, then technically by the Spalding classification system, those should be moved to sterilization. It's only if that's not feasible that then we would resort to high-level disinfection. So yes, as you said, there is a push to sterilization in industry in general, not just with the AAMI committee. But first, I want to bring people back to the baseline that this has already been here. That if you can sterilize those scopes, especially the surgical scopes, then technically we should be doing that.
To speak from the sterile processing and endo side of things, a big misunderstanding when you start talking about sterilizing scopes, it tends to give the impression to folks outside of the hospital realm, or at least outside of those departments, maybe the end user surgeons or what have you, that it excuses the manual cleaning portion, or maybe slacking off on the cleaning side of things, because at the end of all this, it's going to go in the sterilizer, and we all know anything that goes into a sterilizer comes out sterile, right?
Oh, that's a great point to make. And I don't want people to think that by moving to sterilization that we're excusing poor cleaning practices. That is a huge part of what discussions that have been going on in industry in general is, if things are moved to sterilization, you still have that critical importance for cleaning. That soil has to be physically removed from the endoscope or any other medical device before it goes into the sterilization method. The same applies, of course, to disinfection, but I don't want to give the impression that by facilities moving scopes to sterilization that it can then excuse poor cleaning practices. That's not obviously the intent. I just wanted to make sure that people are aware that's what the classification said originally, but we still have to stress these devices have to be completely clean before they go into disinfectant or sterilant. That is not changed. The other thing then we have to keep in mind that many facilities wouldn't be used to, if they are sterilizing scopes that are compatible, those different types of sterilizers like vaporized hydrogen peroxide systems, they do have to implement a drying step. After the milling, those devices do need to be completely dried. And that's something that facilities wouldn't be used to doing. So you really have to logistically look at that workflow if you're moving scopes to sterilization to determine what else you need to do. And I will stress still, as we talked about, the cleaning and then also that drying before it's wrapped for sterilization.
That's a great point, and that goes back to the need to look at a document like ST91 that will outline that whole process, the outlay of the department, the physical setup of the department, as well as the equipment necessary and the testing of those things as well. And I just love how you went into the cleaning portion. There is that idea out there that if we can sterilize something, that automatically makes it safer. But if you're not cleaning something, just as you said, it doesn't matter which machine it's going in, the HLD or the steam sterilizer or the VPRO or Sterad. If it's not clean, it is not coming out sterile. And it's important not only from the user standpoint to remember, but also to be communicating that to patients, even who may be asking these questions as they see the news reports coming out as well. But I wanted to jump back to something that we started this segment with and just talk about when ST91 came out. There was perhaps a culture shock, if you will, maybe for some of the folks responsible for these departments. And I was wondering if you could go over some of the biggest challenges possibly that folks have had to overcome in light of trying to meet these standards that ST91 covers.
That's a great point to raise, and a couple of things come to mind. Something that I still get questions about very frequently is the recommendations within ST91 that have followed through then to the AORN guidelines and even to SGNA, is that within ST91 we recommend to keep any reusable valves, so the buttons, valves, any of those reusable parts together with the scope as a unique set for tracking purposes through reprocessing back through storage of the scope. And that has been a challenge for facilities to implement logistically because those reusable valves don't have serial numbers on them. So that has been one thing that facilities have had a difficult time with figuring out what they're going to do with that to be able to keep the valves together. So I'm talking about the suction valve and the air-water valve and even the air-water channel cleaning adapter. Some facilities will track and keep with that scope through reprocessing and storage so that you have that unique set. And by doing so, if there would be a breach in reprocessing or an outbreak related to reprocessing of those scopes, the facility could pull the endoscope and any of the associated valves out of circulation, to make sure they have all of them to do their investigation. So that's one thing that's been very challenging for facilities to implement. There are a variety of ways that facilities can do that, using things like bags or different holders, or many of these valves are sterilizable, so even facilities will send them off then for steam sterilization, marking it back to the model and serial number of scope that went with. So there are different ways it can be implemented, but that's definitely something that's been challenging and misunderstood as far as ST91 implementation goes. The other has been the things like the quality control parameters that we talked about, namely cleaning verification. And this has been something that many facilities weren't doing before, but within ST91, we have a recommendation to verify the cleaning process by using some sort of cleaning verification monitor, with the timeline being that this should be done weekly or preferably daily for all scopes. So that means that at least weekly, you'd be testing every scope with a cleaning verification monitor, whether that be a test for something like protein or blood residue, or there are different combination tests that test for protein, carbohydrate, and hemoglobin, or using ATP. Those are all different cleaning verification monitors. But by saying that a facility complies with ST91, then there is this expectation that cleaning verification would be done on every scope at least weekly or preferably daily. And from there, then, we see other professional society guidelines that have adopted similar recommendations, such as AORN and SGNA. AORN even has examples for when to do cleaning verification as with each scope or daily. So if you're following AORN, then you might even have more stringent recommendations for how to do cleaning verification. And then my final emphasis for ST91 of what I get questions about quite frequently is transportation of contaminated scopes, because many facilities are being surveyed and they're getting cited for improper transportation of the contaminated scopes. So after the procedure, when the scopes are going then to wherever they're being reprocessed, whether that be in endo, whether that be in central sterile, it doesn't matter, because it's a contaminated medical device. It's governed by OSHA regulations. And that's why there's been such an emphasis on proper transportation. And we deal with all of that within ST91, saying that the OSHA regs say that it should be a puncture-resistant container. So you would want a solid container, and it says leak-proof sides and bottoms, again, puncture-resistant, labeled biohazardous. So that's something that many facilities think, oh, I'm just walking it across the hall, or, I'm putting it in this other type of container that's not necessarily leak-proof, and thinking that that's fine. But by OSHA regulations, that's not fine. So those are some key takeaways from ST91 that I hear often from facilities that they didn't know about or have had difficulty implementing.
I want to go back to your second point too, such as doing some sort of verification, like protein testing, etc. A lot of times people, when they get the data, one of the things they're scared about is, what do we do once we get this additional data? And I'm wondering if there's any components in here recommending what the response would be. So let's say you're doing weekly testing. That scope's been used on maybe, 6 or 7 patients since the last time of the testing. If it comes back positive, what are the facilities' responsibilities at that point to follow up?
Right, and that's a great question. And what you bring to light is the general thought process with cleaning verification and where you implement that. So cleaning verification testing, such as protein tests, as you said, those are meant to be performed after the manual cleaning process. So you're in the sink, you've done your suctioning, brushing, flushing, all of that. You've syringe flushed it to remove the rinse water out of it. Now you're left with having to inspect that scope, part of which is doing the cleaning verification test on it. So what we're really looking for is there any residual soil on that scope after cleaning that could potentially impair disinfection or sterilization? So it's it's a matter of confirming that that soil has been removed from that scope individually, with the thought process being then, if you do get a positive result, that means there's still residual soil left after that cleaning process. The result then of that outcome of getting a positive result on the protein test or other cleaning verification is that you simply re-clean that scope. You do the whole manual cleaning process over again and retest it, and then if it passes, you can move on to disinfection or sterilization. If it doesn't pass, it goes back through cleaning again. So really, you're looking at an individual result, not necessarily going back through the whole week before and since it had been tested previously. We're looking at, is it free of soil at this point in time? Now, something, though, to take it one step further, to keep in mind, if you would have a scope that continually or frequently tests positive after your manual cleaning process for one of these residual soil tests, then I would recommend that you do more with that. Is there something different about this scope? Is it potentially damaged inside, and that's why it's retaining debris? So you can have cleaning verification tests that give you an indication that something else is wrong. So you have to have those critical thinking skills then in place to make sure if you have a tech who's doing these cleaning verification and it's always this one or two types or these one or two serial numbers that test positive, maybe we need to do more. So it gives you that feedback on your process overall, but also of that individual scope and what state it's in.
It would almost seem as though the future of ST91 in this particular scenario is to sort of warm people up to doing this testing after they've cleaned the scope, but that eventually maybe the best practice would be to validate that cleaning every single time. And do you feel like that might be steps that certain facilities would ultimately take over the long haul?
Right. And again, great question. And that is where many facilities are at now, is testing every scope every time for cleaning verification, because to them it becomes a standard of care issue. How can I test a scope daily or weekly, and what do we owe to patients in between there? Shouldn't we do these tests every time to have that feedback mechanism that we're actually getting that scope clean every time? And I think, yes, that is a great practice to have. And in my opinion, that's where things should be moving, to testing every scope every time. And as I said, on the AORN side of things, they do have a recommendation for cleaning verification with interval examples of at least daily, if not with each reprocessing cycle. So you do see some of the guidelines moving in that direction. Now, I can't speak for where ST91 will go in the future, but my personal hope for facilities is that they really think about this and understand the importance of cleaning. And if you do understand that importance, why wouldn't you test every scope? That's something we owe to our patients. There are very little quality parameters and feedback mechanisms built into scope reprocessing, especially on the high-level disinfection side of it. So in my opinion, we owe this for patient care to make sure we're doing the cleaning verification. And if we can implement that every time, that would be the best scenario.
All right, when we come back, we will talk a little bit of the state of the union. Where are we today? Where are we going? And new technologies or instruments that should be on everybody's radar. We'll be back after a short break. We are back with Ann Drosnock, Manager of Clinical Education for Endoscopy with Healthmark Industries. And Ann, a few years ago, or we're a few years out, I should say, from ST91, and a number of high-profile quality issues are behind us. But where do we stand today as an industry, and especially as we're looking to the future? Maybe benchmark us on this episode, and then we can kind of take some steps forward, maybe put on our not our tinfoil hats, but our our little future goggles and see maybe what's coming next.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great thought. And being that we're 2.5, nearly 3 years out from ST91, I do have good things to say and good news, because from what I see and hear from facilities, things are getting better. And unfortunately, it's taken some of these high-profile issues that you've talked about to really bring to the attention the importance of endoscope reprocessing. So we now have this dedication and this known importance to make sure that these scopes are properly cleaned each and every time. And as I said, unfortunately, I think in the past, there's not been that, that highlight to facilities and healthcare to stress that importance related to endoscope reprocessing. The other area where we see more stressing of scopes now than we ever did was on the infection preventionist side of it. And I do a lot of outreach and education for infection preventionists to make sure that they are familiar with proper endoscope reprocessing procedures so that they feel educated enough to go into these reprocessing areas, do some audits, and watch the process and give that feedback as an outside set of eyes to make sure that the infection prevention parameters are there. And we owe it to our patients to make sure we have those eyes and those auditing and feedback mechanisms in place to make sure that we're continually improving. So, yes, I think that from when I started in industry, things are in a better state of control than they ever were before, but we know we can do more and that we have to do better. And that's why following the standards and becoming aware of them and really knowledgeable of what is in there is so important, because as I keep stating, we owe it to our patients to make sure we're doing everything that we can and engineering in these quality parameters up front to prevent something from ever happening.
Yeah, Marianne, you bring up a great point, and I think it was actually the first episode that we ever did for Beyond Clean where we talked about the importance of collaborating on the sterile processing side with your infection prevention department. But it's so true. Those are the very same advocates that you need to be driving these same standards when it comes to scope processing. And I know even from a sterile processing perspective, to a lot of us out there who are not currently responsible for scope reprocessing, maybe it's still in the endo department, we're getting pulled into these meetings, being looked upon as experts and being looked upon as folks who should be able to help improve the process, even if we don't own it in our own department. But we're sitting at the table with folks who may not be as familiar even with ST91 as we are. So it is a team effort in every facility, not just one manager's responsibility or one director. You really have to bring all those folks to the table the same way AAMI does with the formation of its work groups. At the facility level, we've got to get those folks to the table who have ownership, can drive those decision-making meetings there. So I wanted to bring up a question, I guess, on resources. As a leader, I know I just can't walk into a finance meeting or a budget meeting for the next fiscal year with my ST91 or my ST79 and say, this book tells me that I need things and these are the things that I need. And expect folks, to walk out of the meeting and be like, all right, everything you asked for, there you go. On this question, though, how would you advise leaders who know they're looking at this document saying, oh, I do need to rearrange how my physical layout is, or I need another piece of this equipment. When you come into these hospitals, what are you seeing that they're often missing, could use some support to get?
That's a great question. And as you alluded to, what I often see are our workflow design issues and making sure we have that flow from incoming dirty equipment out through the clean side of things. So, and we lay out in design considerations with ST91, although we recommend 2 separate rooms to have that proper workflow from dirty to clean, what do you do if you have a single room, and to really make sure that you have that proper flow of instruments through the department? So I think that is one thing that's missing, and people really need to take a critical look at their workflow And can something be rearranged, or do you need equipment, or do you need to put a divider in place between the dirty side and the clean side? So that is one thing as far as workflow goes that I see often missing. The other thing that's so critical is proper manpower and supply of endoscopes. And I want to delve into this just a little bit deeper, because I hear from facilities so often that they're pushed to to do this faster, get through this process, or the physician is there yelling at them to make sure that that scope is turned around in 5 minutes or something like that. And that just can't happen. These are very complicated pieces of equipment and need a dedicated amount of time to do proper leak testing and manual cleaning and do the cleaning verification testing and run it through the disinfection process or sterilization process. We can't have there be a push for quicker turnaround if we want a quality process. So then that goes back to making sure that procedures are scheduled appropriately, that we take into account enough time to make sure that these scopes have the adequate attention that they need for processing after each and every case, so that they are patient ready every time we turn them back over. In order to do that, you need properly trained and competent individuals to be able to do that process over and over again all day long. So it goes down to a manpower and a training and competency issue. But along with that then, since you may have longer turnover times for that scope to get back to the next procedure, we then are talking about, do we need more scopes? If somebody's yelling at the technician to turn that scope over and clean it faster, then maybe we don't have enough scopes in stock and need to think about getting more of them. So as far as resources go, as I said, workflow, manpower, having the proper people and having them competent to reprocess those scopes, scheduling appointments, or scheduling cases to make sure that there's enough time, and you may get longer times, so you may need more scopes to accommodate those longer times.
Yeah, sufficient inventory is so key. And as we kind of wrap up the third segment here, we're going to get on our Beyond Clean soapbox for you. We're going to go to education. Where are the opportunities for folks to increase their knowledge? And even to Hank's point, maybe there's going to be a transition, or maybe the sterile processing department is going to have to now become the experts in that arena where they may not have had to manage scopes so much before. Where are those opportunities to increase knowledge, and maybe just let's get them pointed in the right direction if they're listening today?
Oh, great. That I am always willing to talk about education and opportunities for people that are in this industry and handling these scopes. What you may not be familiar with is within ST91, there is a statement in there that anyone processing endoscopes, whether it be in central sterile or in endoscopy or bronchoscopy lab, whatever it is, or OR, anybody reprocessing scopes should be certified, preferably as a condition of employment. So we need written into their job description that technicians either become certified within a certain amount of time, or that you hire certified individuals. And if it's not possible to be written into the job description, that those individuals should at least then take or sit for that exam and pass that examination as part of their job performance. So we do have this information that's been in ST91 now for a couple years that says technicians should be certified. And that is because we believe that achieving certification really demonstrates a distinction and a baseline of knowledge for technicians to show that they are competent in their job. They've taken this examination, they've passed it, they have this baseline of knowledge that we feel is so important. These are highly technical medical devices. There are many different types, many different manufacturers, different configurations. You have to know about microbiology and infection prevention and all of this. So it is very complicated to do. So I definitely recommend that anyone reprocessing endoscopes look into certification. And then if you say that your facility complies with AAMI and you want to be to be taking this examination to be certified.
Mary Ann, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about ST91, to talk about AAMI, and to reinforce education and provide education to our listeners.
Thank you for having me.
That was Ann Drosnock, Manager of Clinical Education for Endoscopy with Healthmark Industries. Hank, this is maybe one of our deeper dives, I want to say into the weeds, but I thought Mary Ann did a really nice job of giving us an overview and something that everybody can relate to. 460 comments that they had to answer. That is some meticulous work, and my hat's off to her. That's not something that just anybody not only can do, but wants to do and is willing to do.
Well, the important part about that as well for the existing document, the 2015 version, is that information, as deep and complex as it may be, it's critical to know. You cannot be processing scopes confidently that you are following best practices if you're not aware of that document in the United States. So the fact that they put in all that meticulous work, like you said, just updating it, I think that's a sign of the importance as well.
I also liked her point or clarification on validating the cleaning measures of the scopes, because I think a lot of people do get afraid of data. Okay, once we get this, what are we going to do with it? It's nice and encouraging to know that many places are validating their processes every time, and I know not every institution has incurred that cost or that practice, but it certainly is a best practice for your patients and their safety. I was kind of looking at it like recalls, because, you know, there's that delay, but in this case there's not. They're similar, right, if they don't pass those validation metrics. So how do you respond to that? I think it's encouraging to hear what she had to say there, because it really shouldn't take that much more time. Yes, there's more cost, but it shouldn't take much more time to validate that cleaning.
I guess that's the important distinction is currently we're asking them to validate the process. Is your cleaning process working on a regular basis on an audit of your scope process? But to your point, at some point we've got to get to the validation of the product. Is this particular scope that has gone through this particular process chain, is it clean? And ultimately, if I'm a patient, that's the answer that I care about. I'm not really concerned about how things look last week in general for that one scope. I want to know the scope that you're using on me, it passed everything that it should pass.
Well, I know that you had the opportunity to tour Toyota, and I'll just say, to that point, there isn't a car getting off the line that hasn't gone through those kinds of testing metrics.
That's a great point. And you know, the one thing that I did is we were walking into the Toyota factories. I was looking around the parking lot and intentionally trying to see, are the folks who are working here driving Toyotas, because that says something about the product. And unsurprisingly, a lot of Toyotas out there. All right.
That's great. I drive a Toyota too, so I'll just tell you I'm bought in. And I think the last thing I want to get at from her interview too was the whole fact about drying the scope and the importance of that. And we didn't have a time to talk to her about it, but I'd love to bring it up here as we summarize. The whole concept of flushing the channels of a scope with alcohol, I think a common misperception is that the alcohol is somehow cleaning or disinfecting those channels. But, you know, if you've read your 8th edition manual from Isham, you'll know that there needs to be a certain exposure time with that alcohol for it to perform any kind of disinfecting, process. It's really about drying out those channels because they don't get as much airflow through there. Moisture, after you flush the channels and clean them with enzymatic, etc., need help to dry. And that's the reasoning for using alcohol and the importance of only using that alcohol to flush and not on the exterior of the scope.
Great point. Yeah, and I'm glad that we got to that question with Mary Ann, asking specifically about the equipment requirements that hospitals may be missing, like the right kind of drying cabinets, like the right kind of air to be using as you're drying out these scopes, and even, the right kind of chemicals that can possibly aid in the drying process. But these are the questions, these are the challenges that are real out there in the industry, and I think our show today is a great starter and introduction to these topics for folks out there who maybe have not either had responsibility for them or even been exposed to ST91.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes and Stitcher. Simply search for Beyond Clean. We'd appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to us as we continue to grow the show and bring on great guests like Mary Ann. And on behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.